Thanks for tuning into the Move Mind podcast. My guest today is Sam McNally, who is a black belt under Darragh O Conaill. He's the owner and head coach of Exec BJJ Studio in Dublin, and he's also making himself known at the 66 kilo division in ADCC in just a few weeks in Las Vegas. And a big congratulations to you, Sam, and thanks for coming on the show, mate.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. So, I mean, let's dive straight into the ADCC trials experience then. And we were just chatting there before we went on about my coach Benny back in Canada was over there. I think at the same time as you. Was it in Poland? Am I right in thinking?
Yeah, it was in Poznan. In Poznan, yeah.
Yeah, nice. And how was that as an experience to travel out there and get amongst it going over that way?
Oh, it was really good. That was the second European trial, so I competed in the first one, but I lost in the third round. So then I was very motivated to just fix all my mistakes to go back and win, and then obviously I went back and took the gold. So that was good.
Yeah, it was a fantastic performance. So 5 subs, 5 matches.
6 matches, 5 subs.
6 matches, 5 subs. Okay, cool. So did that mean I guess you took one on points?
The final was on points.
Okay.
In the end, I did manage to submit him. So
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, the finals, it's going to be it's the battle of the toughest by that point, isn't it? Did you have to, that's 66 kilo then, was it in the trials as well?
yeah, yeah,
And are you cutting weight to get down to that?
a bit, yeah. So usually, like in the gi, I compete in feather, which is under 70 with the gi on, so it's not that far off at 66. But I walk around a little bit heavier, so I have to cut down like a couple kilos. But now I'm actually starting the more intense part of the cut now to just take off the last few kilos and make the weight. Because you got to weigh in 3 days in a row for ADCC.
Do you really? Okay, so it's not so much like weigh in once and that's you for the weekend and get massive again. You've got to keep that weight down.
Yeah, yeah, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So
Wow, as if it wasn't already prestigious and difficult enough. That's impressive. So, are you doing the same weight cut strategy that you did for your trials then, or are you making some tweaks, or what's the deal with that?
well, the only difference now is because the camp is a lot more specific for the date of the tournament. The kind of intensity obviously increases, decreases, increases. So at the moment, this is like the most intense week of the camp. So uh, I can't do like I can't start doing any kind of heavy weight cutting until we finish the peak. But uh, there's not too much difference in terms of actually losing the weight. It's just mostly cleaning up my diet, keeping an eye on um, what I'm eating, and then hitting certain goals every week to make sure that I'm on track to lose the weight in time. So
Yeah, okay, interesting. And will you do any kind of water loading protocol with that, or are you strictly doing it just by manipulating on your sort of your macros?
yeah, just diet as much as possible. I don't mind doing a little sweat on the day to warm up if I need to. So it's no problem losing half a kilo or whatever. But I don't want to have to try and repeat the same amount of sweating 3 days in a row.
Yeah.
Just because it's no good for your cardio at the end of the day. Like the finals can be 40 minutes long. So
Yeah, you want to be as replenished and as full up as possible, don't you? Like given the
yeah,
situation. So, with regards to those trials, then Sam, out in Poland, it's going to sound like maybe like a stupid question. Like, what was your strategy going into the trials? I mean, obviously it's to win, but I'm learning in my jiu-jitsu journey that there's so many varied strategies when it comes to competition. What was some of your strategies going into that sort of second time round doing the trials and sort of learning from your first round there where you lost in the third round, I think you said.
yeah. Well, learning the rules, I think, made a big difference because in the first trials, I didn't fully understand the rules and how they work in relation to like takedowns and sweeps, and the the basic way that the rules work is that it's very difficult. It's purposely very difficult to score, um, and also you're much more incentivized to wrestle. So I didn't fully understand what the situations were in terms of when I could pull guard or when I could stand back up to wrestle, or what would happen if you're held in turtle for 3 seconds, things like that. So um, in the first time I did the trials, actually, I submitted the first two guys, and then the next guy, in the first like few seconds of the match, I put him in a triangle, and he held out in the triangle for the whole fight. It was 6 minutes. Um, so by the time that we went into overtime, I had to wrestle, and I was like wrecked trying to wrestle, and then can't remember. Like it was just the way it ended up. I ended up in turtle, and I didn't understand that. The, in the situation, I actually could have just sat back down to my back in the way that the match went. Actually, tried to put a hook in and things like that. So afterwards, I was like, right, okay, I need to learn the rules much better, and also just strategize to be more efficient in that rule set. So, um, you know, having a good understanding of the type of wrestling that you need for the tournament, in terms of like understanding that the length of the match is going to make a difference in terms of how you're going to fight at the start versus at the end, because there's no points for the first half. Yeah, and just basically in my head thinking, okay, I'm gonna, no matter what happens, if we end up in overtime, I'm still gonna win the overtime. If we have to wrestle, I'm still gonna wrestle. Um, if it goes to pretty much any situation, I still have a strategy to both defend effectively in those areas, but also win. And I'll know how I can win from pretty much any place that my opponent puts me in. Thankfully, in the majority of the fights, I submitted the people. But yeah, so I think that strategy is very important to be able to see that in my own mind of exactly how I can win from every single situation, even from the very worst spot to the very best spot. And that's what I'm bringing into the tournament now in September.
Yeah, I love that. That's very meticulous. But you strike me as the kind of chap that's got a good attention to detail on that kind of stuff anyway. So how long does that, it's a bit like how long's a piece of string, isn't it? But how long does that take to really understand how to win from, like you just said, sort of your graded positions from worst to best, figuring out your strategies for your game, your body type? How long did that kind of take to kind of sort of put together?
Um, so the first time, so most of the time up until now, I've trained like in the gi, like I mostly compete in the gi. Um, but I decided in about a year ago now that I wanted to go to the ADCC and win. So I started training for the trials, the initial trials, about this time last year. So I would have started to wrestle and also just like learn strategies around grappling from standing with wrestling in situations where you may not be able to pull guard, or you have to be able to effectively beat someone who might be able to out wrestle you or out hand fight you. Um, because in the obviously in the tournament, it's not all jiu-jitsu athletes. It can be people who are wrestlers, sambo, judo, whatever they want, whatever these people who qualify or are invited are. Um, so that about a year ago, the like kind of training started, and then after the first trials, I ramped it up a lot on specifically on the wrestling, um, and also building certain strategies for like submissions that are more no-gi dominant, working leg locks and things like that. So
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so on the wrestling front then, because this is really interesting, I find there's quite a disparity between wrestlers' ability to wrestle and jiu-jitsu guys' ability to wrestle. Now, understandably, they are two different sports, but often the wrestling, the way it's taught in my experience in jiu-jitsu, can be quite limited, although it's getting much better. How did you go about drilling your sort of your wrestling? You mentioned hand fighting there as well, which is also a pretty vital concept when it comes to setting stuff up. How do you go about drilling your wrestling in a way that um, carries over to your jiu-jitsu? Is it a case of you put wrestling boots on and you do wrestling based rounds with wrestling rules, or are you doing your comp specific rules in a way that you can kind of hybridize it? Like, because it's not a straightforward process, I find, for a lot of gyms to figure out how to teach their guys how to wrestle.
yeah, well, this is it. So for me, I my kind of thought process is like, I'm not going to figure out all the wrestling techniques, even in the space of a year, let alone 3, 4, 5 years. Out here, the wrestling coach is a guy called John Marsh, and he's very very high level wrestler, and I can just, even trying to drill the techniques that he's showing, it's like I feel very much like a white belt in terms of the like physical awareness that you need to be able to actually hit the moves with any kind of good timing. It's like in jiu-jitsu, obviously, say you learn to try and pass the guard, and someone who's experienced can do like a beautiful Toriando and go side to side and connect all these moves together after years of experience. It's very similar in the wrestling in terms of taking shots and setups and things like that. But initially, for me, I just tried to figure out strategies and what I can use to, first of all, at the very least, just try and win the hand fight. So even if I don't necessarily take the person down or have a big repertoire of wrestling based techniques to be able to use, just being able to dominate the first exchange so that I'm at least not getting taken down was my main priority, because I know that if even if there's a scramble and I can work through to kind of create a situation that might open up a submission or allow me in the rule set to be able to capitalize on ways that'll bring me into positions that are better for my game. That was the first thing, and then obviously, so pretty much what I'd actually do is at 7 a.m. on every Friday morning, I would make sure that I would just put 1 hour of wrestling training in my own time. Um, that was only like no jiu-jitsu, no nothing like that, just wrestling, just practice, and just get as many different people as I can, and basically just try and put myself. A lot of the time, I was like just being shark tanked in the middle, just getting them trying to take me down. Even if they weren't necessarily very experienced wrestlers, once it starts to get a bit tired, you can feel, okay, where am I making mistakes? Where should I be able to dominate these controls? To do that, and then obviously in the actual jiu-jitsu training, I'd live myself a lot in terms of my ability to play on bottom. So I found that to be very useful, just to develop like a baseline level of like grappling ability from the feet. Like, and now out here in Essential, everyone is very good at wrestling. They're very adamant about training wrestling. Obviously, JT has unbelievable takedowns, and he's won the tournament twice. Everyone's very adamant about wrestling here. But also, there are a lot of people who wrestled in high school and college. So now I get to actually train and test my own techniques with people who are legit wrestlers, and are actually able to wrestle, just because the level of the it's like when you start to train people who know how to wrestle, it's not necessarily that they have tricks. It's just that the moves that they know very well, and they're very confident to be able to use them. So because when I feel like the level of wrestling that we get in jiu-jitsu is fairly simplistic to be practical. It's like you say, okay, somebody tries to shoot on you, you sprawl. But in wrestling, there's different ways of sprawling. There's different types of sprawls that you can use to defend a takedown, which I didn't even know about. But I find here now my actual wrestling is very different. It's much more open, and I'm able to be much more aggressive on the feet, which is I think key to have in my own mind, especially just in terms of strategies for winning. So.
Yeah, fantastic. I would imagine then the confidence that you build in the training room will lead to that ability to be aggressive on the feet. And like you say, dominate those first exchanges, at least to nullify the initial takedowns. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fantastic. So is it a case of, do you find that the more you do your wrestling, you're able to be relaxed and still be efficient like at your wrestling? Or is the wrestling more just a case of being stronger and more bullheaded on the feet? Because to the naked eye, you can't necessarily tell if a wrestler is like being relaxed or not. It seems like very much like two bulls in a china shop when it's like a wrestling sport. But in my
Yeah.
experience, when you go against a good wrestler, the ones that are the best are actually kind of really like loose and relaxed. So is that what you find as well?
Yeah, yeah. A lot of what I feel is, well, first of all, kind of a degree of humility or patience to recognize when the appropriate time to actually try and shoot is, because, um, if you make a mistake against somebody who's not necessarily an experienced wrestler, it might not be a huge mistake, because they might not have the control to keep you down or to be able to counter you. But against someone who knows what they're doing, you have to be very sharp. So that's one element of it as well. Um, and then the other part is you get somewhat more relaxed, but I feel like it's more you can just see slightly further ahead in terms of what techniques are available to you. You're able to connect a couple of positions further on. But one of the interesting things I find about wrestling is that, like, having an ability to be explosive and strong does make a big difference, especially as rounds go on. So, as you get later into rounds of wrestling, being able to be efficient enough with your energy expenditure so that you're maintaining a good level, a good base level of you know, energy, or like, you know, not being fatigued makes a big difference, because obviously there are situations where you can have great technique, but also the thing is you can drive the person over and you can tackle them. So uh, being able to maintain your ability to do that over a long period of time through conditioning is, I think, makes a big difference. Like in the training, we do a lot of conditioning, much more than I've ever done before. Um, which, you know, ironically enough, you actually, throughout the camp, you lose the ability to see the benefits of that conditioning, because you are obviously fatigued when you're training. But I know now, in 3 weeks or so from now, 3 to 4 weeks from now, after doing the peak of the camp, and then 3 weeks from now doing the peak of the camp, and then tapering down, by the time the tournament comes around, I'm going to be, you know, significantly more stronger, athletic, explosive conditioned, compared to, you know, today, so to speak. So
Yeah.
it's interesting.
Yeah, I'd love to get into a little bit more of the details of your camp in a bit, mate, because I like the fact you even said the word taper there. That's encouraging that there's a little bit of periodization going on there. So with the conditioning side then, that's fascinating with the wrestling. You say there's a lot of conditioning there. Are you talking about conditioning on the mats doing wrestling to get your conditioning, or are you talking about doing conditioning in a weight room using apparatus to get your conditioning?
Well, like, there's obviously, even so, like even just the warm ups are hard. So like even just warming up to train is hard enough that it's essentially, it's a warm up, but it's also a test of your actual physical conditioning every single day. Um, which is interesting because I've never trained like that before, but I think that's more of a wrestling mentality. Again, the wrestling coach here, his name is John Marsh. He runs a lot of these sessions. So it's, I think a lot of the planning in terms of how this is structured is taken directly from wrestling rooms, but the actual warm up is difficult in of itself. And then even after training as well, at certain stages, there is just extra conditioning, you know, just basic level like body weight exercises that you just do repeatedly just to increase your actual work capacity. Now, it's obviously planned out in a way that it's not going to impact you know, your training, or to make you injured and things like that. But yeah, the conditioning side of it, I think it is very unique, but I think that's very specific in terms of the wrestling, because wrestling is a lot more intense on the body than jiu-jitsu. And then obviously the length of the matches, again, finals can be 40 minutes long. You have to be able to fight 40 minutes effectively, and still be able to push up until the last, you know, 39th into 40th minute. You have to be able to pick up the pace still, you know. So
Yeah,
yeah, and then obviously
that's
just
interesting.
wrestling itself is conditioning. It is very intense on the body in for proving conditioning. So yeah,
Yeah, okay, that's fantastic. I think that's something that wrestling gets right actually a lot of the time is getting your conditioning stimulus from doing the sport itself. Because
yeah,
you're not going to replicate wrestling even with like, throwing a sandbag around and getting some intricate work to rest ratios in the weight room, right? It's going to be best done with another training partner doing wrestling. And
yeah.
then do you find that you do a lot of positional work in your wrestling sessions as well, or is it more just like open rounds where you've just got a strategy in mind, say, apply the right sprawl to the right takedown that's in front of you?
Yeah, well, like there's not too many very specific, because it's, I think it's hard to make the training as specific in terms of positional training as you can with jiu-jitsu, because in jiu-jitsu there are obviously so many defined positions where you can change it and make the situation very specific to say, okay, you know, when this happens, we stop. Whereas wrestling, obviously, there's, you know, takedowns, scrambles, people can stand back up with their feet, so it's a much more open style of grappling. But what I find is helpful for me is being able to just have in my own mind certain strategies and things I need to make sure that I'm able to do, and also improve on as we train. And then yeah, it's mainly uh, obviously doing that exclusively in terms of wrestling, and then starting to combine that with jiu-jitsu as well. And then there's obviously certain drills of things where you have multiple partners trying to take you down in a row, things like that, that kind of will refine all that and put it together. So yeah, it's good.
Yeah, that's really cool that you've put yourself in the sort of the proverbial deep end there, like you say, feeling like a bit like a white belt in the wrestling effort, but you're going to absorb a shitload, right? And then in your mind, setting your own goals of what you need to achieve combined with absorbing what you're being taught. I really like that. And arguably, yeah, the Americas have got a greater pedagogy of wrestling than the UK, so you've got to kind of get out there and immerse yourself in it, haven't you, really, I suppose, to get the
big time.
most from it. Yeah, that's very cool. So you strike me as a really intelligent chap in terms of, like, you know, steering your own learning and stuff like that, and across I would imagine a variety of fields. I was watching your tape of your second round there in your ADCC trials, and you had, I think, 3 submissions by armbar, and you got a savage armbar, which in nogi is hard to do because of the lack of friction, right? I was wondering, when it came to your own learning, I'm really interested in the idea of learning how to learn as a concept, sort of the meta approach to learning anyway, but I'm very interested, obviously, how it applies to jiu-jitsu and grappling. And you strike me as someone that's, like, you know, you've learned a lot of things and steered your learning in a sort of self-governed manner. That armbar that you were pulling off there in the trials, is that like one of your weapons that you've kind of, you know, spent time on honing as a craft? And if so, how did you go about kind of like implementing it into your game into a way that you can pull it off under the most pressure against the best people in the world?
Yeah, I think for me, like just in general in train, like especially for all the years that I've gone that I've trained for what, like 11 plus years now at this stage. So even when I started training, there's always a group of us back in Ireland that were this is my kind of self motivated to train. So obviously Darragh was a coach, and then there was a group of other people that would just train and travel and compete. But as a group, we never necessarily had like I was about to start like a black belt to teach us. When I started training, like Darragh was a purple belt, and everyone else was like white and blue belts. So even just rising up through the ranks was always a case of that. Everyone had a different body type. You'd have to figure out your own kind of uh, game because there was no one necessarily to emulate to specifically. And then from that, obviously, there are certain elements that you're going to just start to pick up on a bit more as you go. For me, just like for example, with that armbar technique, a lot of the style in which I like to play guard, like that kind of open guard, especially playing reverse del Hiva in nogi, just makes the opportunity for submissions like that quite open. And what I've found is developing very strong fundamentals to the point that even in the worst positions you can still get out, gives you a lot more mat time in those positions to be able to develop things that are specialized, like certain submissions. So what I mean is that for me, I spent a lot of time trying to build strong foundations in my guard so that I understand how the position works much more than necessarily any kind of sweeps or submissions, so that I would be able to spend long periods of time without getting my guard passed or without having to change the position. So that would allow me to see better opportunities in terms of what submissions or sweeps would be available, and then build a game on top of that. And obviously, if you have a couple of positions like that, you can start to connect them together, and then as you connect them together, they're going to open up other opportunities. So, for example, with that armbar, it's like that's just a common reaction that people do when you play that position, is to grab your head, but it's as a consequence of me trying to use the, say, reverse Hiva position in combination with back attacks and trying to transition to other guard positions that opens that up. It's not necessarily that I'm trying to go out and grab someone's arm the whole time. It's just that the style that I'm playing is meaning that it means that there's only a limited number of techniques that the other person can do to try and stop what I'm doing. And with a lot of experience over time of seeing the repeated patterns of what someone can do to try and stop your A game, so to speak, you start to develop habits that are almost predictable for your own body to be able to see. Okay, it's very common that somebody's going to grab like this, and I can hit the arm like this, and then you can start to obviously consciously add in a couple of different setups and a few different tweaks. So I find that's it. But yeah, for any kind of like uh, self motivated learning or discipline, I think being able to just figure out in your own capacity what the most important aspects of the positions are in terms of defense and control give you a much better ability to actually add more in over time. Because if you don't have the foundations of being able to defend, escape, control, If you end up in a bad spot, you're not going to be able to get out, but also you're not going to be able to maintain the positions for long enough to actually see these openings over the span of years and years, you know? So that's my
That's
thoughts,
very,
anyways.
yeah, very interesting. That's very cool. Okay, so if I understand correctly, then we're talking about um, understanding the mechanics of the position without any subs involved to start with. Just understand where your off balances are, like you say, how you can defend yourself, how you can
Yeah,
avoid like getting squashed or whatever it's if it's on the bottom. You sort of your worst case scenarios and the mechanics and the like the real sort of I guess like first principles of your position, and
yeah,
then
exactly.
add it on top with your subs based on the reactions you're going to get to you maintaining and controlling that position.
Yeah, and obviously you have to develop the physical ability to do it because in theory you can learn lots of things, but the actual physical aspect of it is kind of a separate, unconscious thing. I always felt like if you watch people skateboarding, you know, people, you could tell someone how to do a skateboarding trick over and over and over again, but it's not unless you put in all the reps that you're going to be able to actually do it. And it's very similar, you know, even like balance on a skateboard, because that's, I think that's very specific example. But like obviously with jiu-jitsu, if you were to take that same idea, it's like before you can even, you know, attempt to move around in a position or something, you have to be able to actually maintain it first, you know. So
Right.
um, yeah, even just the concepts of how that works. Like, don't let someone grab your head. You know, stay on your side. Things like that when you're playing your guard. Keep your history. Keep your legs dexterous to be able to pummel stuff like that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you mentioned there in your explanation, you were talking about how it allows you to get a lot of mat time. So, in terms of setting your own training goals, then would you set something like, I'm just going to start this sparring round with my reverse de la Riva, let's say, and my goal is to literally just observe the reactions that come about from me controlling and maintaining the position?
Yeah, or even have a certain amount of like something I used to do a lot when I was younger is I'd give myself a certain amount of time in each position. So I'd say like, okay, if I'm playing guard for the first 2 minutes of the round, I'm not allowed to sweep the person. So I have to, you know, that forces me to be able to maintain the position for at least enough time that I can kind of see some reactions or a thing I used to do a lot as well, especially with the Gion, was to try and learn to play guard without having to grip anything, because then that teaches your body to actually react in a way that will allow you to defend even as you start to get very tired. Because you know, obviously, as you get tired, your grips start to get weaker. Even if especially if your opponent is strong or athletic or has good grips, you have to be able to defend without actually using the grips, and then that translates very well into no-gi, I find, because you're relying on the actual fundamental aspects of the position to be able to use it effectively, as opposed to some kind of a trick or some kind of a strong explosive move, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very cool. Sort of handicapping yourself in order to get your own training goals established. Yeah, that's very clever. I
Yeah.
really like that because I'm a massive fan of trying to be as efficient as possible with the mat time that I get, because I know one day if I make it to being an old man, the way I'm going to be able to do stuff is going to change, isn't it? So I really want to make the most of the time I've got, but at the same time, I want to do it in a way that's going to, elicit the best responses for learning whilst I've got these sparring rounds. So I'm definitely going to try and employ some of that ideas around maintaining the actual position first, and then sort of add in your subs and stuff on top. Yeah, I really like that. That's a real smart way of doing it. Um, Sam, you were talking a little bit about your training camp, and there seems like there's a bit of a periodization sort of approach going on there. That's quite smart. It's quite modern. The old school
Yeah.
approaches of last man standing are somewhat falling to the wayside now, and it's nice to see that drifting not just from sort of the MMA world, but into your grappling sports as well. How did you come up with sort of like this periodized approach? Are you working with anyone for nutrition or S&C or anything like that, or is this something that you've kind of put together and sort of honed over the last few years on your competitive circuits?
Yeah. So before coming to New York, especially after the pandemic, as I started to get back into competing, um, in my mind, I want to make it so that I'm able to train as efficiently as possible, because I also think about this in terms of actual the full competitive career that I have and the goals I want to achieve. And I know it's not forever, so I have to make sure it's done in a very specific time frame. So I have to be as efficient as possible in terms of what I'm going to push my body to do. So um, back home, I have a strength and conditioning coach who helps me a lot. His name's Connor McCabe. His gym's called Strength and Performance, and he uh, helps me a lot in terms of programming, and then like performance optimization, obviously things around long term, like over the course of years of training and thinking about it, if you're training today and you make the right type of plan, 5 years, 4 or 5 years from now, you could double your training capacity in terms of how much work you can put in per week, if you're clever, I think. So um, for me, being able to do that, especially because now I can see I look at this like the beginning of my professional career, but I'm also looking at it in terms of the end as well, because I know there is an end to uh, physical ability as you get older. I'm 7 now, so I have a couple more years, but I am thinking about it. So, putting in the time to actually plan out training in a way that is with long-term goals that are designed towards optimizing your ability, as an athlete is important, I think. So that's something I think about. And then for this camp in particular, the training principles are, proper. This is proper, like related to sports science, and that's a lot of the reason why I actually came and stayed here, because I could see how professional things are done here. Um, so yeah, in my own time outside of, say, for example, the HC camp, I do have periodized paths within each camp, and then obviously throughout the year as well. So I have rest times programmed in, which I think is very important, because that is for longevity, as well as obviously the actual strength and conditioning program that Connor looks after that for in a long term capacity. But then here, the actual camp is done as a periodized camp with kind of the planning. Again, outsourced. A lot of it is John and also JT together to make it so that pretty much I feel like I can just turn up, train, and know that the level of intensity is going to be high enough to get the right amount of stimulus for adapting for it, but then also programmed in a manner that won't overdo it, so that it'll fly peak, and start to repeat that over and over again. So yeah, it's interesting. I don't know very much about sports science, to be perfectly honest. My wife is studied health and performance science in college, so she gives me a lot of input in terms of things that I should be trying to pay attention towards, and obviously surrounding myself with people who actively work in the industry is key, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You're smart to outsource it, mate. That's super smart. Like your S&C coaching, periodization in terms of, yeah, where it comes to nutrition, and then your intensities of actually like what it looks like on the mat, because there is intensity on the mat as well as the weight room. There's multiple elements to intensity, right? Especially across a training camp, and it's the perfect kind of alchemy of getting them all like together. And like you said, recovery is the other side of the coin of work. And I think for high achievers like yourself, very often like planning rest is very non-intuitive, and it feels like you should be doing more and more and more in order to get better, when actually you can get better by planning in some rest times.
Good. Well, I think something that's kind of started to strike me recently is like, hard, people say hard training. You got to train hard. You got to train hard. It's like, you could turn up to a session, and in the first 20 minutes or first 30 minutes, you completely burn yourself out, and then just kind of tip along for the rest of the time, knowing that even if you try your very hardest, your physical ability to keep going has been shot basically from your lack of planning. And you can still walk out of there and say that was very, very hard, but it's almost a kind of a con. Whereas what I notice now with actual hard training is to be able to push yourself to the point that you're about to burn out, that you're about to be completely spent, and then taper it back, and then try and do that again, and then taper it back, and then try and do that again, and repeat that over and over again, both in individual sessions and across weeks and months. And that's what I find the training out here is very much focused around, because a lot of the times in training, it's not the case that what it does. Okay, this does happen, but it's not the case that I can't get up off the mat after a round. But it's the fact that you have to get up off the mat. It's structured in a way that you are going to get up off the mat after each round, and then you're going to go again, and then you're going to have enough time to recover to make sure that you can do that again to get the full amount of most efficient work done in this limited space of time that you're naturally going to have as mortal people. So yeah, it's a different. I think it's a different way of training. I think this is starting to come a lot more into sport now. So good.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, sounds like what you're describing there, Sam, is the sort of the theory behind intervals, which is you can get
Yeah,
more efficient work done in a same amount of time than you can just absolutely going to sort of balls to the wall, like perhaps people have done in the 90s. And whoever
yeah,
was left standing, like you say, whoever did get up off the mat, well, they were the one that you put into the competition then because they're obviously the toughest. But unfortunately, with that method, you might have ignored the other champions, potential champions in the room because you didn't periodize it properly. But your intervals where you're working up to just up to your threshold and then backing off and getting your recovery, learning how to recover better, which is also kind of a skill in itself, and then combining that into these sort of spiked interval efforts allows you to get a lot more efficient work at higher intensities, right, without burning yourself out, which is a very smart way to do it. Yeah, I'm glad you've picked up on that because I think that's key, and also from a mitigation of injury standpoint too, right? I mean,
yeah.
which is
Uh,
massive in grappling, like S&C and strength sports. It's kind of prevalent if you're pushing yourself hard to get stronger, but for the most part, grappling is the injury rates are massive, and so mitigating that with intervals, I think, is a lot smarter than just trying to see who's the toughest, right?
yeah, and I think for your mindset as well, knowing that the training is going to bring you to a point of uh, the most difficult. It's not that it's going to be you just work hard and then you get tired and then you just try to keep going after you're tired. It's that you're going to bring yourself in these training sessions and in these weeks and months into very deep waters because when it gets hard enough to the point where a lot of people would essentially burn themselves out to the point that they can't keep going. That's almost like a rest. Obviously, you're tired; it's almost like rest. But when you have to repeat it over and over again, and you know that things are structured so that it is going to drag on and be grueling because there's not this burnout phase like you might like I think a lot of people train like that's very tough on the mind. It's super mentally draining. It's super emotionally draining, but it's very very good I think for your mentality because it teaches you to like swim in deep waters, and to know that you can bring, especially if you're competing in the tournament, to know that you can bring the other person into that place with you and have already been there for a long period of time before that, and know you can keep going when they're going to start to slow down and you pick up the pace. I think that's key.
Yeah, that sounds like an element of maybe one of your strategic implementations there into how to do it on the comp day. I like that, and the interval kind of style training, yeah, it allows you to build confidence, doesn't it, in those deeper waters? Because the training itself doesn't really allow for failed reps in the sense of burnout. Like if we took burnout as the equivalent of a failed repetition, let's say,
Yeah, yeah,
because you're slightly shy of the burnout, your body's not going to learn the failure of collapsing exhausted. But if you're riding it right to the edge, like you say, you're confident in being able to go to deep waters. And then as a strategic option, I like that. You can bring them with you to those deep waters, knowing that you've been there, and then using that to let them make mistakes and kind of get your contribute to your victories. That's very smart.
that's what I'm thinking about a lot now. That in terms of the match length and structure and thinking like that, it's like let's go to the absolute limit of what we both think that we're going to be able to do, and I'm going to break you essentially.
Yeah, yeah, that's very cool. I like that, and that's a smart way, I think, of training it in the dojo to be able to pull that off. That's very clever. Now, I wanted to go a little bit deeper then onto the sort of the injury side of things. I was delving through some of your past interviews, and I think I'm right in saying during lockdown you hurt yourself on a herniated disc in a deadlift. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, the deadlift is what triggered it, but obviously had herniated disc from just general wear and tear.
I see.
Um,
Okay, so that was the kind
yeah,
of the straw that bulged the camel's back, was it?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Pretty much. Yeah. So that
Yeah.
was 20. That was like April 2020, I think, or June 2020. I can't remember exactly when, but yeah, that was in 2020. So
And was that L5S1?
4L5.
Okay,
So
that is the common territories, yeah. And I've done L5S1 myself, so I'm super familiar. Out of interest, how did you go about rehabilitating that and getting yourself back to a place now where you're about to compete on the biggest stage in the world?
yeah. Well, initially, I was very demoralized because herniated discs, or if someone's never had one before, I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. To be in so much pain for such a long amount of time, because there's like a constant, it's like kind of a constant low level, the kind of agony that you're in when you have the disc like touching a nerve. Um, yeah, so initially I went to a doctor to get an MRI, and then he referred me on to a surgeon, and he said to me, "This is a common enough injury for people who are older to get, and sometimes they never recover. But you can try surgery." And I was like, "Oh, I don't want to do surgery at this age, you know, because I still obviously want to like, you know, surgery is kind of maybe a last ditch option, or it's something that is beneficial maybe if you're not going to try and push yourself to the point of you know, like this type of in this type of training." I actually have a friend who did surgery a similar time, and it worked for him great. Um, but this was like, he didn't do it before we were both injured at the same time. It was just that for me, I was like, well, I'd much prefer to try and exhaust all other options in terms of physical rehab before trying to have any kind of medical intervention. So I went and I found physiotherapy in Dublin. There's a place called the Savagery Sports Clinic. It's a hospital, and there's two parts. One's a hospital, and then it's the other part is physiotherapy and rehab, and they deal pretty much exclusively with athletes. So I went there and I met I met a physiotherapist who specialized in back injuries. So it's kind of cool because they have loads of physiotherapists, and when you do an assessment, I think they match you up with someone who's more specialized in the area you're trying to fix. So she started me on a program that was really simple, of just basically body weight exercises to try and manage the pain for the first couple of months, maybe first like 2 to 3 months. And then as I started to, obviously the inflammation started to go down, and then the pain, well, not necessarily pain threshold, but the actual level of pain started to decrease. We started to add in more resistance. So it was a really slow, progressive uh, process of just, you know, working with like very basic body weight exercises, starting to add in band work, like really light band work. Because what would happen is the frequency obviously started to decrease over time, but it was every like week to 10 days I'd go in, I'd get an assessment done of just my basic strength in different positions, and I didn't realize how much actual movement I lost, and you know, from the injury, because obviously when you are injured, some of your muscles try and turn off, and the other ones try and turn on to adapt to the kind of change in your body. So there were certain positions where I'd lost a lot of strength and lost a lot of mobility. So we had to slowly build that up to a baseline ability to complete just basic exercises or basic tests that the physiotherapist would do. And then started to add in band work. Eventually got to the point where I could start to lift weights under a barbell again. And then after maybe 6 months or so, 6 or 7 months, I was able to do a little bit of jiu-jitsu. One of the cool things was is that she was always trying to encourage me to get back to do jiu-jitsu to see what this stimulus would be like in terms of pain and on the body. And then eventually got to the point where my base level of strength was strong enough, and my pain was low enough that I could start to lift weights under a barbell. And then it was again just a slow process of getting back to training, of being very disciplined in terms of how much work and effort I could do, and also like I couldn't necessarily play the positions I wanted to play at the start, because I like my left hand, it was like on the left hand side was where the disc was, so trying to play guard on my right hip would be you know, obviously trying to bend over like that was kind of difficult. So I had to slowly work back, but then eventually I got it together. I think that yeah, it was difficult though, the mental drain of having an injury like that is because you worry whether you're going to ever be fixed or not, you know, because it feels like it may never recover.
Yeah, hundred
But now,
percent.
thankfully, you know, I can train at the highest level there is with as much intensity as possible, and I'm good. So thank God.
Yeah, amazing. Wow, that's a good testament to your recovery process then, and your work ethic, and the team you had around you there with the physios. That's great. You stumbled, or not even stumbled upon, put yourself in the right environment to get the right treatment early, which I think is key. And it is a long road. It was, yeah, the best part about 9 months for me, and something I'd never wish on anyone and never want to go through again. Just out of interest, Sam, were you ever taught to brace formally around the timing that this happened in 2020?
For lifting weights, yeah. So I had when I initially started, so like I would start lifting weights when I was like 17 or 18. I got pretty good coaching at the start in terms of technique, but I didn't really keep it up over the years. So naturally, so even though I understood like at a basic level how to actually, lift and brace properly, it just, if you don't have, so now when I lift weights, I have a coach that watches everything I do and tells me how to adjust it as I go. But obviously my technique started to kind of crumble over time, and that definitely contributed to um, the injury. Because something I noticed as well is that that was definitely very preventable if I had just put in a very small amount of effort in terms of strength and conditioning recovery, and like kind of prehab and rehab would have mitigated that injury. You know, over time, if I just done, if I just been doing a little bit, once or twice a week of just a couple of exercises to ensure that whatever toll my body was taking from doing jiu-jitsu was being kind of like balanced out from a little bit of strength and conditioning work would have probably stopped that, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, it goes a long way. The detraining effect is real, and just because you know how to lift doesn't necessarily mean your body knows how to lift when your body's taken time off, right? And
Yeah.
it can be a big shock to the system going back into it, even if you have been taught with good technique. The reason I ask about the bracing is I find so many people that lift weights have never been taught formally how to create pressure through their abdomen, and not saying that that is going to mitigate disc issues at all, but I think it can definitely help to lift in a more safer fashion to help prevent it, providing all other things are taken into account. But yeah, props to you for coming back from that. That's a big injury to come back from and kind of piece yourself back together. So do you keep up your S&C now? I know you're in camp now, so your S&C is probably very specific to what you're trying to achieve now. But outside of the ADCC kind of timeline, is S&C something that you kind of incorporate into your training now? Because again, that's something that's kind of people are taking more seriously now than perhaps they ever did before.
Yeah. Even so, like outside the camp, you know, even if I wasn't doing jiu-jitsu, I'd always make sure that I at least get one session in a week that is specifically designed to keep my body in a shape that's usable. So it's like a lot of it. It's like injury prevention is a huge aspect I think is important, but also just for being able to be aware of your kind of like your actual physical capacity is important. So you can see if you're starting to lose strength in certain areas, um, or you're just taking wear and tear and might not be prepared for it. Just even as you get older and you're grappling and you're maybe the positions you're doing change, the stimulus in your body's going to change as well. So if you have a certain pattern of movement that might be conducive to injury, you need to, in my opinion, be able to have a counter to that. So yeah, I always make sure that I have like at least one session a week where I have like a coach who's watching my technique and programming and making sure that I'm doing everything correctly. And then depending on the time of the year, obviously add in more sessions. So like right now I live twice a week, and it's very specific to the camp, but that would be pretty much it. But I always make sure that I'm like, no matter what, just one time a week, lift weights in a way that's designed to use as a complement to training. It's not trying to tire yourself out or become really really strong. It's the complementary aspect for injury prevention is important, I think.
Yes, 100%. In order for you to train on the mats for longer if need be, and yeah, avoid injury as opposed to trying to turn you into a world record strongman. That's not quite the goal of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when it comes to coaching, obviously you're running Exec BJJ there in Dublin. You got your school, and you're coaching a crew there of varied belt levels, I imagine. When it comes to teaching, have you taken any sort of a specific approach into being able to teach the information in a similar way that you've learnt it? So what do I mean by that? If recall is the most important aspect of jiu-jitsu, if you can't recall the information under pressure, what's the point? How would you go about teaching your students to recall the information that they teach you? Do you have like certain ways you structure your classes, or certain ways you go about sharing your information at all?
Yeah, well, so obviously at the moment I'm away, so I have coaches in the gym that are working there to teach the classes. But something that I've noticed that I think can make a big difference for, so like, as far as being a coach, goes, I'm definitely much more of an athlete than a coach at the moment, you know. So obviously I have my students and I teach them all, but me sitting there, taking individual people and being like, do this isn't so much necessarily what I do, but what I find is that being able to read the room in terms of what the people collectively need to work with, I think is kind of the main thing that I focus on when I'm teaching, because I noticed that how I'm portraying the information, I'm making mistakes the whole time that I don't realize, and then that gets translated into how people roll. And I can see what the mistakes are that people are doing and they're rolling, and I'm thinking the reason they're making these mistakes is because I'm the person making the mistakes teaching. So I find that obviously as I'm coaching, I'm trying to have a specific curriculum that are base level techniques I think everyone should be able to do. But then on top of that as well, actually fixing the mistakes that I'm making when I'm teaching is a part of it as well. So like an example, just this is a common one, is people doing a knee slide and not making an underhook, and it's like, okay, I haven't emphasized enough that they're not doing an underhook. So it's like, how can I incentivize people to use an underhook in a way that is effective for passing the guard without necessarily getting too bogged down on the specifics or making it kind of boring. So um, yeah, that's one aspect of it, is obviously having a base level of techniques that I want people to be able to work on, and then refining them in terms of my own ability to teach. I think is really, really important. Um, and then another part of it as well is how can I get people to do as much of the moves that I think that are important for them to be able to do without necessarily having to be overloaded with information. So a lot of specific sparring, I think, can help with that, because everyone's different and everyone learns in a different way. But at the end of the day, we all do, have a baseline test that is the same in terms of the rolling on the mat. So, um, it's I think it's more art than science, but I do try to have a base level curriculum that I want people to follow. As I'm teaching the curriculum, I'm trying to make adjustments myself to make sure that I'm portraying the information in the most effective way possible, and also correcting the mistakes that I'm making as I'm teaching, so I can see that they get translated into the students on the mat, and then obviously adding in positional training in a way that's effective, so that people can, um, have a chance to actually use what they're taught in the training, but also, yeah, use it in a way that is conducive to their own development optimally, like so that they can see that the test at the end of the day is that they can actually do it in training. Because um pretty much what I tell people is like, I'm going to teach you the moves that I want you to try do to me. Because if I'm outside of training camps, I still obviously want to get better myself as well. But I think people really like that too, because there's kind of you get to have authentic training with someone who's trying to do it at the highest level, but also as well, you you're gonna see the kind of levels of techniques when you start to work through this. So yeah, and that's
Yeah,
obviously for the slightly more advanced students who get that. So
that's smart. Yeah, I remember listening to Musa Mecci talk about that on Rogan the other week, where he teaches all his students to give him all the reactions to shut his game down, so that he has to come up with new reactions.
yeah, and that, yeah, well, and like I think that's much more interesting for people to engage with as well, because then they can see what works. Because if I'm trying really to stop all these things and then something works, even if they're a blue belt, it's like, okay, I think that is going to you know be much sharper in your mind, because you can say, okay, like that, I think this move actually works, I'm going to keep trying to do it. So it's much more encouraging, I imagine, for someone to learn like that, as opposed to just being like, okay, do this move, guys, try it in training, here we go. Instead of being like, just a lot of the time at the start of the class, I'd be like, look, I'm teaching you guys this move, so I want you to try to do it to me and see if you can beat me with it. So yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. I think that's the one of the future elements of coaching evolution as it goes for jiu-jitsu, is to be able to teach your room moves that need to be done on the higher level people in the room, so that the higher
Yeah.
level can then develop off of that, and it kind of creates this sort of cyclical feedback loop where it jumps up every sort of revolution, as it were. When it
Yeah,
comes to curriculum, you mentioned there you do have a curriculum in mind when it comes to, there is a base level of moves that you do want people to be able to pull off. How do you go about sort of articulating that curriculum? Is it something like you do like, okay, we're going to do a week on this and then we're going to do a week on this, and you kind of block it out? Because that's one style of kind of teaching, although my opinion is I found that I actually forget the stuff that we did 3 blocks ago when we go to do a blocked sort of approach. Do you have a kind of a sort of an approach in mind on how you kind of deliver that curriculum so that people don't forget what you did last month?
yeah. Well, so specifically on that question, I actually just have um, so like I built so like the way that I manage my gym is with software that I built myself, so that every week for like the members they have like a dashboard area that they can log into, and the techniques of what we're using in that week will be covered from stuff that I've filmed in the past, so that they can just reference it.
That's very
But
cool.
then on top of that as well, uh, something I like to try to do is to put tournament dates in a calendar, and then build games for people, working up to those tournament dates. I find that's really fun, and then people actually pay very close attention when they're incentivized with a goal to learn, because then what happens is that obviously they compete, and whether they win or lose, or they make a few mistakes or lots of mistakes, they have something to work on in their own time too. But you see that trying to get people to remember the actual techniques in the way that I would like them to remember is, I just think it's impossible, because everyone learns in a different way and a different pace. But being able to just give people a general idea of things that they should know, so that I oftentimes will say to people, it's like, you this might not be relevant to you now, but I want you to know that it exists, so that in the future you can come back and you can ask me more about it. So I think kind of the way that I like to approach it. But yeah, I do have just just like a members area that people can review the techniques, what we're covering every week, so that they can just watch it over again. And then obviously with the tournament date set in mind, so people can build a game off that. I think that's a really fun way of doing it too. So
That's very cool. Yeah, I like that tournament calendar idea. Yeah, I'm definitely going to try and steal that and peddle it forth to my various partners and coaches. That's very cool. And I did check out your members area on your Instagram kind of screen recordings there of how it works. I think that's very cool. And I actually think every school should do that. And I don't know why the instruction is not filmed just to make use of time when an instructor is teaching a technique. Film the bloody thing, because now you've captured it. You only got to film it once and put it up on the fucking dashboard for the members. Like, it's not, I mean, you're a smart dude with coding and stuff, obviously, but it's not rocket salad. Like, you can do that pretty easily. And even you can have a private YouTube account, that
like
people
a
have to link.
YouTube account.
You can do it. And I don't know why schools don't do that, because it's like, if BJJ Fanatics has proved anything, it's the fact that people want to consume information digitally in video format. Now, why not make that service available to your members? I just think that's just a no-brainer to me. And I saw how you set yours up, and I was like, Sam gets it. I was like, he's figured it out, because he's realised that recall it, like you said, in the way that you want your students to remember it, might be an impossible task, but you can definitely increase the odds of recall
Yeah,
by having sort of a curriculum for them to access, a library for them to access, a catalogue, which is something Robert Daigle talked about a lot. If you want to get good at coaching, you got to catalogue moves into categories. And if you want to be able to recall, understanding cataloguing and categories isn't a bad idea, because it's quite an efficient way to bring knowledge to the surface, right? So I'm very encouraged
yeah.
that you're doing that for your members. Lucky guys at the exec station there. They got a step ahead of the game. I'm going to let you go soon, mate. So I know you've probably got more training to do later on in the day and stuff over there in New York. But before you go, you did mention, you got some competitive career goals before the body gets too old and we can't really achieve what we wanted to do. I wonder if you could maybe share what are some of those goals you've got in mind. I mean, I can imagine what the next big one is going to be, but yeah, what are some of your competitive goals that you've got set up for yourself?
So my uh, most like the highest level goals I have are this year. I want to win the ADCC under 66 division. Um, so that's goal number one. Goal number two is 2024 black belt featherweight world champion. So when I finish the um, ADCC, I'll put the gi back on and give myself 2 years to win that. And then in 2026, I want to win the ADCC again um, in 66 again. So yeah, those are my goals. Obviously, there's lots of tournaments in between that, like the other majors and there's another ADCC obviously 2 years from now. But just in terms of how I've structured my training, it's those goals: 2022 under 66 ADCC champion, 2024 black belt featherweight world champion in the IBJJF, and 2026 ADCC 66 champion.
Fantastic. I think they're great goals, mate. And I'm obviously going to be glued to the screen to see what happens for ADCC this year in as many of the divisions as I can. I'm going to need probably 10 sets of eyes going along, but I'll be definitely keeping an eye on your progress as well. I really like your approach, and you've taken a smart approach to your training, and I really like it that you're going after it yourself and making it happen for yourself. And you mentioned you're out there in New York at Essentials. Where is Essentials located? Is it on Manhattan Island?
No, it's in Yonkers, so it's north of New York City. It's in
Okay.
White Plains, so
Okay.
it's just outside the city.
Okay,
Yeah,
sweet. I'm heading to New York at the end of September for a little trip, and I'm looking at places to go and train. So I'd love to go and check out
I
this
would
stuff.
highly recommend if you get the chance to see this place, because the environment that JT's made is it's insane. It's really something special. So.
Okay, fantastic. Well, in that case, I will put it on that little trip bucket list then and make sure that we get a chance to go and train up there. That would be lovely. If people want to follow your journey, Sam, and follow, your own sort of your social media, and then perhaps your school and any of your coaches that you wanted to shout out, do you want to drop some of the handles? Obviously, I'll put them in show notes as well so people can access them. But how can people follow you going forwards?
Yeah, just Instagram, Sam _MC _NALLY, Sam McNally. Just if you want to keep track of what I'm doing, give me a follow there.
Yeah, I think people will, mate, because when you sort of, I know you haven't been coming out of nowhere. You've been chipping away at this for years, but when you do pop up through the trials brackets, people get their attention sort of flicks on a bit, doesn't it? And then when they see you on the actual under the spotlights at ADCC, people really start to pay attention on who's this guy, especially pulling off arm bars from the bottom like that. I think it gets lots of people's attention. Sam, this has been a fantastic chat, mate. I really appreciate you taking time out of your training camp to chat to me, and I wish you all the best of skill. Come up to ADCC. I hope you go in there and slaughter some people. I'll be paying attention. And yeah, I hope the rest of the camp goes well and the taper goes well, and you're really enjoying yourself, and get out there, son, and get involved.
Thank you, Harry.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. And I'd love to get you back on again sometime in the future, and maybe we can reflect on,
Sure.
past performances and go from there.
Let's go.
Yeah, fantastic.